Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our third and final webinar of the EHDEN Roadshow. My name is Dwayne Schultes, and I'm the Managing Director of Vital Transformation. I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. Today's webinar is called What Will the Pharma Industry Look Like in 2030? Digital Discovery, R&D, and Post-Authorization. Now, before we get started, just a couple points for you. If you're having trouble with your internet connection and bandwidth, we've provided several phone numbers for you. Just push the little arrow in the control panel next to your mute button. This little menu will pop up and you can switch to the phone number. We've provided several dozen phone numbers. As well, we're also going to be taking questions from the audience. Obviously, we can't open up the microphones. There's close to 100 of you on the webinar today. So please submit your questions in the little question bar at the bottom of the menu. There's a little Q&A. Open that up, put your question in, and we will answer the questions as they go forward. And again, we'd like to thank you for your participation, and we look forward to having your questions. So science is leading us down the path of increasingly targeted medicines with equal advances in genomics and our ability to develop personalized therapies for patients. However, there are increasing challenges in the development of drugs for ever smaller populations, since by definition, the rarer a disease, the fewer people there are with the disorder that can participate in clinical research. EHDEN and other GDPR-compliant data sharing platforms provide an alternative approach to drug development that enables researchers to search millions of anonymous patient records to model different scenarios and health personas to accelerate the development of medicines currently not available to patients. In this session, we'll provide an overview of RCT-alternative approaches, as well as explore the potential of machine learning and patient-reported outcomes within the clinical trials domain. And we have an exceptional panel for you today, and I'd like to introduce to you now, firstly, Nigel Hughes, who's the EHDEN Project Director from Janssen Clinical Research and Development. Good afternoon, Nigel. How are you, sir?
I'm very good. Good afternoon to you as well, Dwayne. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nigel. We're also joined by Magda Schliebus from FPA that most everyone knows. Good afternoon, Magda. How are you?
Good afternoon. I'm well, thank you.
Thank you, Magda. We're also joined by Kai Langel, who's from the Trials at Home IMI project. He's their technical lead at Trials at Home and is also from Janssen Clinical Research. Hello, Kai. How are you doing, sir?
Hey, Dwayne. Doing very well. Hello, everybody.
Thank you, Kai. And finally, we're also joined by Elizabeth Vroom, who is the chair of the World Duchenne Organization, representing the patient voice. Hello, Elizabeth. Thank you very much for being with us today. Thank you, Elizabeth. You were muted, but we saw you mute, so thank you very much. So just to begin now, we'd like to start off with sort of the overview on how the industry is moving. Magda, you've been heavily involved in many of the IMI projects. Obviously, you're the head of research at FPA. How are we doing from a technological standpoint at harnessing these from an industry perspective, and how are we moving forward with enabling innovation?
Thank you, Dwayne, and thank you also for the invitation to this very topical and very timely webinar. 2030 and healthcare in 2030, and therefore by extension the pharmaceutical industry, will be driven by data and by extension of our knowledge of biology. But data would also enable that biology discoveries. And it would be driven by 3 levels of integration. And I think that's where we would really see the biggest progress and where the technology would be at its full speed around 2030. The integration that will really impact on patients' journey, on patients' experience, but integration that would also start with the patient at the heart of it. So the 3 levels of integration is data integration, its technology integration, and its products and services integration. All of that enabled by standardized data that everybody can access, exploit, and use. And this will impact, again, on 3 levels. It would impact on the way we do research, in the way we do clinical research in particular, on what we deliver to patients, the type of products and services, and then on how we deliver those products and services. So let's start with how we do research. With patient preferences at the start and these data and digital enablers enabled by standards, that's where EHDEN is so important. We would do research and generate data that are much more precise, that much more accurately reflect real life and would complement and integrate with the more conventional research. So platform trials, basket trials, trials at home, pragmatic trials, that would be the standard. That would no longer be the exception of the pilot. That would be fully integrated. And what would that give us? It would give us more relevance for patients and for healthcare systems. It would just bring research much closer to the reality. Second level, it's what we will deliver. So data would help us to deliver beyond the pill. We would deliver health, we would deliver products and support, much more than just the medicine. I think that's super important. The other point is that data would enable going much earlier to the patients. It would enable interception of diseases before the symptoms appear, or even before the side effects hit us. Again, all of that would be heavily dependent on data. And then finally, data and the standardized and connected data will deliver the best combinations of interventions for the patient to improve the patient's journey. And I think, again, that comes not only with the data from the pharmaceutical sector, that would come with the integration of various products and services, the 5Ds: data, diagnostics, delivery, drugs, and devices. And finally, how we would deliver more precision, real-time adjustment to treatment, and more outcomes, all of that enabled by data standards. So this progress in Europe would be enabled by projects like the European Health Data Space. And these projects need to fully integrate and upscale enabling initiatives like EHDEN that creates those standards and enables making that data space a reality.
Thank you, Magda. Boy, there's a lot there to get into. We'll certainly add a few questions to our open discussion. Obviously, there's a lot of a technology bent to a lot of what we're discussing with the harnessing of data. Now, Kai, you're a technical lead and you're responsible for taking that technology, that data, and harnessing it. Can you talk a bit about the technology tools that are facilitating personalized medicine and patient-centric approaches?
Yeah, I'll talk about some of that. Also, just want to start about with the data and the collaboration, because I think if the American dream is about the big hero who saves the world, I think the European dream is a collaborative one, where we need to really work together to share and all of that. And I think with COVID, we have seen how this can really work very nicely, where that situation has really supercharged the collaboration in the industry, where scientists and researchers are now sharing everything they possibly can to really help the world emerge out of this crisis. It's not a single hero that will help with that, but everybody working together. And I think it has really opened a lot of eyes to what the benefits of this are. And we can all see the evidence in the speed of these developments with vaccines, with therapies to get over this COVID pandemic. And I think I agree fully with Magda that I think things will become more and more personalized, more and more patient-centric. And this means that we need biomarkers that we can use to really identify the right individuals for the right therapies. And the same things need to be also reflected in trial endpoints as well. So we need to really be able to measure those things that are most meaningful to patients, which often means that we have to move closer to the patient's real lives. So we need at-home measures, which often are digital, to provide these opportunities. So we have more opportunities to really do like continuous measures, measure things that were not possible to be measured before. The challenge is that it's really, really hard to develop and manage these kinds of measurement tools. There's discrepancies in the way that technology evolves, which is very fast. Every year we see a new Apple Watch come to market, whereas clinical development can easily take 10 years. So all of these complexities needs to be really managed. And we need better frameworks in place to be able to do that kind of things. And all of that. Together, we need to really find alignment standards and be able to share data with each other to develop these research tools. And then as a good example of some of the sort of potential of these kinds of tools, I want to tell a story of an experience that I took part in some time ago. It's really eye-opening for me. So this was actually a virtual reality experience where two doctors were able to meet in a virtual doctor's office, and with voice controls, they were able to bring up a patient's mammography images in the virtual room. And these two doctors were able to manipulate the images in 3 dimensions and discuss the best treatment options. That was also integrated with a data set of 20,000 images and outcomes, which was then powered by AI. And the AI also chimed in with an opinion about the best treatment pathway for that individual patient. So in fact, it was not only a meeting between two doctors, but actually the two doctors and this artificial intelligence. At the end of the day, the doctor still made the decisions, but the computer was there to make sense of this available data. It was just really just a proof of kind concept, but it was very real. It was actually all fully functioning, and I think a really good illustration of what is possible already today. These tools are already out there. We just don't really know how to make full use of them. So this experience was built by DFKI, which is the German Research Institute for Artificial Intelligence, and they are the world's largest not-for-profit AI research facility. And I think, well, they're new to pharma, but it's a good example of what these kind of new entrants can bring to our space. And I think over the next 10 years, I hope to see many more examples of that, where we can learn from other players in the ecosystem around us. So I'll just leave it there for my intro.
That's great, Kai. Thank you. It's an interesting point on AI. Just one point, though, quickly. Could you just tell a little bit about Trials at Home, just what the project is about, please?
Yeah, sure, of course. So Trials at Home is another IMI project where we are developing a framework for these remote decentralized trials in Europe. So we're going to bring the research to patients' home through telemedicine, through the use of wearables. We're looking at the regulations, compliance, privacy. We're looking at the best practices. We're looking at the technologies that enable us to do these kinds of things. We're looking at the stakeholder landscape as well. So what does it mean for our current, site partners, for regulators, for patients, to see how aware and ready they are for these kinds of models. So it's a 5-year project, just completed the first year. So much more to come from Trials at Home.
Thank you very much, Kai. And obviously, when we're discussing enabling technologies that you're discussing for bringing clinical trials closer to the patient in the home, Magda's talking about harnessing data broadly for patient preferences, bringing research much closer to reality. That's a quote that Magda used. Obviously, this all involves around the patient. Elizabeth, you represent patients. What is the work that you're doing in regards to all of these enabling technologies and the use of data? How do you see this playing at Duchenne?
Yeah, thank you. So we at Duchenne decided that if we really want to move things forward, we should have our role in data, because with all respect, preference studies, prompts are very often designed by people who are not patient themselves, and very often just don't hit the real reality patient want to bring forward. So we do our own patient preference study we set up. We have developed a patient-reported outcome, which is developed, validated, and now used by a lot of companies, and we are still the owner of that. But I think most important is that we realize that with the data, the one who has the data has the power, don't get me wrong, but having data is very powerful when patients indeed want to play their role in drug development and have their story across. So for the reuse of data, we see that a lot of data are still kept in silos. People say GDPR is important and difficult. What we did, we turned it around. We said, if patients have all their own data lockers, and they can get, because in GDPR, it's stated that data should be available in machine-readable, portable format. So if all data come together in the patient locker, the patient can give access to their data for reuse, and they can choose themselves. So that is indeed the patient in the center, that they have the position to decide who can reuse the data. They have access to their own data. They can fill out also questionnaires relevant to them. What are the relevant prompts for a patient? And when it comes to industry, we also start now to work with first companies to give the clinical trial data back to patients. So also then they can put their clinical trial data in their data locker. And I think by 2030, everybody should have that. So that's important. And the other thing is, of course, we ask also other patients, organizations or groups should get the data back from companies in order, clinical trial data, for example, or other data, to reuse them for not only for modeling, but also for all other kinds of policy making. So I see by 2030, I see that we have patients really have a different role in data, and not only in the collection of data, but also in the decision how data are used and where they can be used for. That is definitely what I think should be the future, and we started to do so.
That's great, Elizabeth. And you presented this at EMA, and it's sort of considered now one of the best in breed, if I understand correctly.
Yeah, it's always a little bit strange to say that about yourself, but it, really this should be the future of data collection, that patient. But also it means that the data are really used. Also, when a patient goes to a hospital in emergency, you have all your data with you because you have them in your cell phone. So you can just, whatever data are needed, you can find it. So it's much more also that patients themselves can benefit from the data, as well as that they can be used for clinical trials, access to drugs, and so on.
And how long have you been working on the project?
We started like 3 years ago we started earlier with the preference study and the PROM and so on, but this Duchenne data platform. And we were very lucky to work together with Foundation 29, which is comes also from a patient background, non-for-profit, but led by an AI specialist and a father of a child with a rare disease. So we are really in a very good environment to move this forward, and with people who really know that data are important too. The first time, maybe very brief, the first time I arrived at meeting for EMA, I gave somebody a hand, a Dutch regulator, and she said to me, are you from the patient? Drugs are approved on data, not on emotions. So that taught us that data is the language they speak and understand, you know, and not only for regulators, wherever you come in policy making, that it's just the language. So that was when we started to collect already more data, and that is like 10, 15 years ago. So we have a lot of data collected and done research ourselves, yeah.
That's great, Elizabeth. That's fantastic. Thank you very much. So finally, last but not least, we're going to go to Nigel Hughes, who's going to discuss a bit about the EHDEN project. Specifically, Nigel, the floor is yours. I got your slides up. You should be able to see them.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. I'm going to buck two trends. I'm going to use some slides compared to my three colleagues, and also look the least like my profile picture compared to anyone else on the webinar. So thanks for the opportunity to discuss this. Some excellent points made already as well, which we're going to have in the Q&A and further conversation later. I think I'll just pick out a few key points actually in terms of looking forward to 2030. I think one of the things that we're not very good at as a human species is looking far ahead and also looking far back, and we don't tend to learn terribly well. So I think at least looking back maybe 2 years and looking forward 2 years is probably a kind of comfort zone. But actually, if you look at, and if you're familiar with the Gartner hype cycle, which I think many of you probably are watching this, it's fascinating to look back to 2010 and the Gartner hype cycle then, and then one as of August this year for 2020, and to see what was kind of reaching the peak of expectations right through to the plateau of productivity in 2010, that many of the things we actually take for granted now, right through to what's kind of sexy and hip and topical now. One of the key things is seeing how at the top of peak of inflated expectations 10 years ago was 4G. And we're now seeing the rise of 5G, of course, going through on the 2010 curve, but right through to various different technologies, particularly related to machine learning and AI, is much more prominent now than it was clearly 10 years ago, and reflects the technology of the time as well. We barely had the iPhone. If we go to the next slide, of course, we're living in the same momentous historical time is an understatement. I quite like this cartoon, which is basically who led the digital transformation of your company. Was it the CEO, Chief Technology Officer, or indeed COVID-19? And clearly, the pandemic, with remarkably large-scale international negative aspects, but also some positive trends in terms of acceleration for certain things we're doing, whether it's in terms of technologies. A good example may be telemedicine, at least in the healthcare field, let alone teleworking. But right through, of course, to I think reinforcing as kind of dark lens on our society that we are still having problems because we don't have the right data in the right place at the right time to answer the right questions. And we've clearly seen this year with this pandemic. And that's something that we really need to be mindful of going forward in the future, of course. It's not just for COVID-19, but it's been a large boulder in a pond. There are going to be a lot of ripples from this over the coming years, politically, economically, sociologically, and technologically as well. Let's move to the next slide. Thank you, Dwayne. Some of you may have seen this before, but just a quick kind of overview of IMI and related programs, some of which have been mentioned already. But actually, if you go back to 2011 to 2016, we had electronic health records for clinical research that was acquired in its post-IMI phase by Trinetics a couple of years ago, last year. But that was kind of a foundational network project looking at optimizing clinical trials. We had EMIF, European Medical Information Framework. These were conceived around 2010, 2011, almost 20 years ago. We have to think how much time has elapsed and how much change there has. When we started these projects, our world was really quite different for pharma, but also from a technological point of view in the healthcare domain and so forth, expectations and our ability to meet those. EHDEN, I'll talk a bit more about that a bit later, but the European Health Data and Evidence Network had started in 2018 to 2024, actually. That's a typo on my own slide. But actually, if we stop as a project then, that will be rather calamitous. This is building infrastructure for the coming decades, but there are numerous other projects. EU Pearl, which speaks to Magda's comment earlier about new attempts to do things like basket and platform studies and protocols and so on. And I think speaking to Elizabeth's comments as well about patient-generated data, the H2O project starting now, going through into 2025. So many of these projects will take us through in the coming years, through this decade, and certainly impacts on the, in terms of the second half of the 2020s. And a number of other projects in the so-called Big Data for Better Outcomes program and IMI, from Pioneer in prostate cancer to Harmony in hemato-oncology, or Big Data cardiovascular, and Roadmap in Alzheimer's, which kind of are EHDEN-like in terms of developing networks in specific disease areas. But clearly a massive shift, I think, coming forward in the years to come, related to this whole concept of a European health data space, a federated network across Europe. EMA, European Medicines Agency's program around Darwin and creating its own network for pharmacovigilance and safety, but also outcomes research as well, which is going to be, I think, really important from a regulatory context within Europe, marrying what's happening in the US and internationally. Let's move to the next slide. And I think this probably mirrors comments made earlier, but I think I've often called this a triad of diagnostics, therapeutics, and data. And I think if you don't have all three, you can't actually have personalized medicine. But yeah, we talk a lot about therapeutics, and clearly that's very much at the heart of what we do in terms of pharma, whether that's molecules, biologics, devices, and so on, increasingly diversified, but also the ability to diagnose, evaluate, monitor, and understand outcomes as well, all of which results actually in points of data. And actually, you need to integrate diagnostics, therapeutics, and healthcare system engineering supported by data to really realize, I think, the expectations around precision and/or personalized medicine. And we're clearly not there yet, but we've got much more progress to have made. Certainly accelerating since 2010 to 2020, and now from 2020 to 2030. And clearly for us as an industry, things are changing already very rapidly. And we're very much more interested in things like phenomics, phenotypic and genotypic or other omics data to give us biological insights, targets, outcomes research, and so on. And then if we move to the last slide very briefly, how does EHDEN fit in? Well, we're an IMI project. We're a public-private partnership led by Erasmus Medical Center and Janssen, 22 partners in total, harmonizing data at scale in hundreds of millions of health records across Europe, working with the new SME marketplace, if you like, small to medium-sized tech firms working to do the harmonization in collaboration with us, and data partners who we can support both technically and financially to do this work. Create a federated architecture, so data stays local, no central database or data lake, but retaining local governance and so forth. Kind of a little akin to Elizabeth's point about data lockers, but kind of similar principles, if you like. But ensuring you can take the question to where the data is, not move the data to where you want to conduct your analysis, for instance, but do this within the federated network and with the technology we already have today, within an open science community, which I think is very key in terms of multiple stakeholders, whether that's clinical, academic, payers and government, patient organizations, NGOs, industry, all working together in terms of realizing research, insights and so forth, utilizing such data under all the right conditions. Education is critical. I think every major player has pointed to the need to upskill digital education, if you like, and utilization of observational data and the requisite ability to do that within our workforce, inclusive of industry, of course, and emergence of data science over a formative number of years will only accelerate. But ultimately, and that's what EHDEN, I think, will be measured on, is can we actually evaluate outcomes? Can we impact on clinical practice today, not in several tomorrows? I think in the 21st century, what's very clear is we can no longer wait years to decades to gain research insights that will improve outcomes and affect clinical practice in terms of clinical reality. And I think this is very much about creating 21st century tools for 21st century research and ensuring the right data is in the right place at the right time. And we've made a lot of progress on that, but we still have to do a lot of work still over the coming years and decades for many of the programs and mechanisms. And I'll stop there. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you, Nigel. That's excellent. So I'm going to bring everyone back now. I'd like to, before we go into the Q&A, I'd like to ask everyone a poll. If you look at what we've been discussing here, Kai talked about that Europe's approach is much more about sharing as in comparison to where I'm sitting currently today in the United States. And Nigel's been talking about the federated database approach of EHDEN. Magda brought up the fact that patients are going to be providing more data, as obviously Elizabeth is doing that right now with her organization. So a quick question, by 2050, yes or no, do you agree with this statement? By 2050, over 50% of all European randomized clinical trials will be executed on a publicly run and or funded database. So is European research going to be more publicly driven, more collaborative? Is this the way we want to go? So I'm going to leave that bubble away there for a little bit and let everyone answer on their own time. I'd like to begin, just let me open up here the floor for you folks. Magda, what do you think have been the key innovations from the industry perspective? You've been at the heart of IMI since 2010 until 2020. What do you think are the key ones? Nigel brought up a few. What do you see as the key ones with your members?
I think all of them have been mentioned already today. Our knowledge of biology, it's one. The data, it's the second. And collaboration is the third. And I think we've talked about the three. It's the combination of those three, which, if nurtured today, would really deliver that vision of different patient journey 2030. So yeah, I think these are the three most important components of success.
And then Kai and Nigel, I'll come to you first, Kai. Going forward now for the next 10, 20 years, what do you think are going to be the enabling technologies of the future that we really need to have in place in order to facilitate this?
Yeah, well, if you had asked me end of last year, I would have talked about, telemedicine and these direct-to-patient trial models. But you can forget about all of that. That's already happening, and all of that. So that's kind of current practice already. What I think will be the next big thing is this digital at-home measures that will be very patient-centric, things that patients care about. The current challenge is indeed the validation challenges of those, the life cycle management of these sort of measures. There are some really significant efforts happening in the industry, still quite early stage, to accelerate that space. I think there will be lots of acceleration in that domain. The kind of data also tells us that, because we see lots of experimental measures being used in earlier stage trials. We see very little use in pivotal trials, phase 3. We don't see any approvals yet based on digital study endpoints, for example. I think those will come in the next decade. The preparations are starting for that. The regulators have been very open and more than supportive. They've been even challenging the industry to move more in that direction. So just like we saw the boom in PROs 10, 15 years ago, I think we'll see a similar boom with these digital measurements that will not replace PROs, but will complement them. The patient voice will always be important, but I think we can supplement that voice with this objective, continuous data and be able to measure these new things. I think in the next 10 years, we're going to see a lot more of that.
Thanks.
Can I just add one additional element to my first element? The fourth element is patient engagement and patient voice. And I would have forgotten about it if Kai wouldn't have mentioned that now. So 4 elements, not 3.
And PROs are patient-reported outcomes, just for everyone. So if we're using shorthands, let's just make sure we're clear with everybody. Nigel, you were jumping in, please.
Yeah, I think if I could add to that, I mean, much of what we're discussing is in the realms of a socio-technical construct, and I think not to decry some of the technological challenges that we still have, but we've made a lot of progress still. And I think, as you outlined already, Kai, as good examples. And so elements of this are also around what I think, Elizabeth, you were alluding to, is around, if you like, a kind of circle of trust model, which is very citizen-centric. I wouldn't even say patient-centric, but even citizen-centric in terms of, our data, which is not just in healthcare, but in other social aspects of our lives, financial, you name it, and about having that control, which allows flexibility in terms of how close you are in terms of intimate data about a citizen, or how far away you are in terms of the resolution of that data, but also its oversight, its governance, and the trust around different parties interacting with that data, including us in industry, which I think will be critical, obviously, in continuing to improve upon healthcare outcomes, predominantly for what we're doing now, but also certainly for still many diseases where there are inadequate treatments, or certainly no cures and so forth, that we need to respond to, which are increasingly even more challenging, as we will see changes also in our environment and so forth going forward over the coming years, unfortunately. So data, I think, is extremely clearly at the heart of this, but it does need to be within this kind of socio-technical construct, which also then incorporates the ability to create standards at these different levels of trust as well.
Yeah, and bouncing off that citizen-centric nature that you're talking about, Nigel, I'll share the results here. Generally, 2/3 of our audience today do believe that clinical research in Europe will be driven by publicly driven data assets. I'll leave that up for a sec. Elizabeth, given the conversation we're having now, I mean, what has been the pickup and the interest in your tool? Do you see it accelerating? Are you getting more and more people coming to you to try and have you actually in the driver's seat around some of these clinical trial projects?
Yes, but I think we're still also in the stage of raising awareness to patients who are so used that registries are run by clinicians or by institutes that you say, like this, you have much more control over that. I think that is very important. That's what we see. But we also see, and I think the whole field, not only Duchenne, but the world should learn more. We hear now again about PROs. I see so many PROs which don't ask the right questions, because the questions are created. It's like the biomarker in the past, and everybody says, oh, my biomarker is doing fantastic in this disease. But if the patient doesn't reflect the quality, what it means to the patient's daily life, then it doesn't help, And with the PROs also, I think a patient should be in an earlier stage involved in creating these PROs, and then they are also aware that they respond to questions they think are relevant, because they have to do work, for this data locker but it's when you get a questionnaire and you think all these questions are not relevant to me, or I'm not, then you stop filling them out. If you feel this is really what I think is important that companies or regulators or whoever know, then you will be more active. So I think also there's something to do there.
Yeah, Nigel, I'll come to you, but first I just want to remind the audience, please submit your questions if you have a question for the panel. Obviously, we will talk amongst ourselves as we do all the time anyway. That's not a problem. We can certainly continue on this way, but we would love to have your input. So please, little Q&A button, push the button if you got a question, please submit it and we'll incorporate it into our discussion. Nigel, please, to your feedback, please.
No, I mean, excellent points, Elizabeth. I mean, I always often use the analogy that, if you imagine an individual patient, citizen, who's, say, asthmatic, goes to see their general practitioner or similar, and says, and the GP says, well, your peak volumes are great, and this is looking good, and so forth. How's it going? Since you changed your inhalers, for instance, and they turn around and say, well, yeah, okay, I changed my inhalers and so forth, but I still can't get up the stairs in the morning. Which is the, what's the one thing that's really,
exactly.
functional quality of life? Or is it just the lab values? And that's the kind of conundrum we're always facing in a kind of Western model of medicine. But also importantly, in EHDEN, we have to recognize this too. It has to be kind of phased. I mean, a lot of data we're talking about is clinical record data, for instance, from clinics, hospitals, primary care, and so on, claims data, all sorts of different types of data, which tells you a snapshot. It tells you a little bit about what's happening in an individual's life. And bearing in mind, a lot of people are talking about have chronic disorders, or we're born with it, and will die with it. This is over years to decades, and we have to get much more adept at having kind of temporal understanding of trajectories of individuals, which will also help us in our research within industry, of course. But also, I think, linked to that, the expansion of different types of data that generate far more holistic view, a 360-degree view, if you want to call it more, in terms of every individual's existence, life with a certain disease, illness, or whatever, or comorbidities, again, under all the right governance and so forth, and kind of augmenting that data, filling the gaps and so on, adding new insights and so forth from additional data to the records we have, new tools. Natural language processing is expanding very rapidly, but we need to do a lot more because, we're still really dealing with a fraction of the data which is meaningful. There's so much out there we generate ourselves or generated about us that could give us much more meaningful insights, and probably new insights and trends we just haven't seen yet.
Magda, just coming back to you, picking up on this demonstrator project aspect of this, making it real. You obviously at FP deal more with the regulators. What are you hearing from the regulators about what they want from these products? What are they looking for from an evidence standpoint?
I think we all look for the same thing, but we sometimes lose it of sight. We want the shorten the path to diagnosis, shorten the path to treatment, and to create better outcomes for the patients. We want to create more health. And the regulators, they say within the current confines of the current regulation, you can do a lot, but you need to bring to us the best possible evidence and the most reliable data. I think that we do agree also that technology advances super fast, but its integration to decision-making is painfully slow. And the reason is that nobody of us has really all the knowledge in hand. So we need to co-create that knowledge. We need to have the iterative continued dialogue between those who generate the data, who do research, whether in public or private sector, and with the regulators, the decision makers. That needs to be an iterative process of building trust and confidence, putting this data to test all the time, and then getting what is the most useful for making a decision that would not neglect patient safety, but that would help advancing the innovation at the same time. And I think we hear the regulators hear us. Now, I think we just need to put the necessary resources into it, and all of us together, and just to admit that nobody, as I said before, has all the knowledge in hand, and that we need to sit around one table and co-create that body of knowledge.
That's great, thank you. We have a question here that just came in from a Chris Moder. Thank you very much for your participation, Chris. We appreciate the question. Do you think an average patient can understand all of the technical things you are talking about, or only a very small percentage of the patients will be presented to if they're under a test? Elizabeth, what do you think? Is this too technical, or do you think the average patient will be motivated? What do you think, Elizabeth?
Yes, it's a very good question, because it's both. And if you say 2030, I also think like the patient will understand more about technology, and technology will even be more for all patients what they use. But I think when it comes to asking patient to participate in all this, then we have to make sure there's something in that for them as well. And we have to make them understand what's in it for you and for future development, but also today for you. So I think that is important, that we not only make understand that there's a lot of technology around, but like how it really can benefit or your community, or how it can benefit yourself. I think you need both, because at the end, everybody also wants their own benefit. And I fully agree with that. You won't reach all patients with the new technologies. That's not happening at the moment, but you can help them as good as possible and make it as, for example, we also have on the same platform, we have frequently asked questions, so the questions, what people want to know, we also have these questions there, so they can also go to the platform and just learn themselves about the collected data and so on. So I think that is how you educate them about this. So one is the technology itself, the other is what it's in it, what's the motivation to do so. Does that answer your question, Kev?
I think it does answer for Chris. Yeah. Kai, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, so I think the technology to some degree is just a tool and a means to an end. And I think it is the end that is meaningful to patients. So they care about outcomes, not so much about the technology that might help you get there. So in terms of making these things relevant to patients, like today, patients don't have that much choice in what kind of treatments or outcomes their therapies are targeting. So maybe in the future, they will have more choice, where they might choose one therapy over other one, depending on what outcomes are most meaningful to that patient. And maybe the measurements that will help generate the evidence directly to the patients and doctors will also follow that. So if physical activity, for example, is more important to you than pain reduction, then we get you on those therapies and we measure those outcomes that matter to you most. And maybe that principle can also extend to the research side as well. So maybe in future trials, there will be some patient preference endpoints or outcomes that will be measured where there's actually some choice. So instead of us dumping a bunch of PROs to you that are not meaningful to you, maybe you actually have a choice. We might get more insight that way, and we can deliver a bit more patient-centric trials. And there are already some tools in place that sometimes allow patients to track things that they care about outside of the trial protocol. So I've seen apps where patients can actually define their own questions, and they can actually track their things that matter to them. And this can be a great tool to actually uncover new insights. If you see all patients tracking one thing that the protocol is not tracking, then well, why isn't the protocol tracking that thing that all patients care about that we just didn't get incorporated into the protocol? So maybe these kind of patient-preferred measurements and trials will start to appear in the future, rather than everything being driven by the sponsor company. So yeah, just to throw out some.
Oh, thanks, Kai. I'm going to, Nigel, you want to comment in, please.
Just, I think one of there's a number of different aspects to this. One of them, I think, is generational. You know, as we see younger generations growing older, of course, but with digital technologies, expectations change, inclusive of in healthcare, and expectations will clearly be, you know, that expectation will impact on healthcare providers, the industry, and many others, key stakeholders. But I remember several years ago speaking to Eric Topol, some of you may recall from Scripps, who wrote The Creative Destruction of Medicine, The Patient Will See You Now, and so on. So I was at HIMSS meeting in Las Vegas, and I asked him a question about access, and he didn't answer. Not having a go at Eric Topol in his webinar, but I think it's an example of a challenge here that I definitely agree that technology will allow us to do many things, and often regulatory aspects will have to catch up with that. We've seen that for many years. But so does things like reimbursement. And one of the key challenges also will be how to ensure there's not an increasing digital divide between those who can, those who can't, based on access, but also on how things are reimbursed. So in some respects, not just for the industry, but the healthcare industry and how things are reimbursed, payers and so forth, you know, beyond regulators and so on, will need to develop a much higher degree of maturity in responding to this evolution in our technology.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. And Hilda Stevens has a question sort of related to that going forward under IMI. And this is a question for Magda. IMI has changed patient engagement and has put the dialogue with the patient on the foreground since 2010. What room for improvement could still be envisioned with respect to the use of patient data to optimize and speed up drug development going forward? What do you think, Magda? What do we need to do?
Well, I think we need to implement what we develop in pilots. We need to make it a reality to start with. We are in this continuous.
Do we have pilotitis?
I think we have more pilots than airline companies in my medical research, which is, you know, in IMI we have so many fantastic projects that may be just a publication on the shelf if we are not very careful, and if we do not immediately now start looking at ways to implement those in practice. So just coming back to Hilda's question, in IMI, we have projects like Prefer on patient preferences, we have Mobilize-D on digital endpoints, we have EHDEN on data standardization, we have Radar on monitoring, remote monitoring of patients, we have H2O on outcomes, you name it, all of them deliver tools for patient centricity. Are we really, as companies and our stakeholders, implementing those tools in their daily research practice, in their decision-making practice, in their medical practice? I think that, and the same holds true for all European Union's program and for all programs wherever they are funded, is that, you know, we finance a little element of that, but then we somehow forget collectively about let's implement that alongside the project development in practice already. Let's think about it. And I think that that's the big improvement that we can bring in terms of patient centricity. It's to really start implementing the great tools that we deliver and scaling up immediately, rather than waiting until the end just to have a great publication. Let's think in parallel, engage dialogue with decision makers, with funders, with whomever holds the key for deployment. Let's think about deployment straight away.
That's great. Thank you, Magda. And again, Hilda, thank you very much for your question. Kai, you brought up AI in practice. How do we better incorporate AI into these IMI programs for decision making, and how do we do it earlier? What needs to happen? What are those steps?
Again, AI isn't very intelligent without the data. So
okay.
All kinds of AI applications are very data hungry, and without data, you just have an empty shell, really. So I think the first step is to make this all data usable, connected, so you can find it, and it needs to be standardized so it becomes usable, and that is the big challenge in the data science work. Most of the effort goes into curating the data in this right shape and format, and then only then you can actually apply these methods to it. The AI work itself, you just need the right people and tools to do it. That's not really the challenge as far as I can see it. I think it's mostly about getting the data ready that's kind of holding us back. The tooling is out there, the expertise is out there. Maybe we need more of it, but that I don't think it's the big bottleneck. I think it's getting access to the right data in the right format and all of that. I'm not a data person on the panel here, but Nigel seems to be nodding, so I must be saying the right things.
So Nigel, okay, let's say we need the data, we need the AI platforms to feed the data to feed the AI platforms. Let's look at this from the other side, though. What about the practitioners? Because as we know, there's a lot of research and there's growing body of evidence that the practitioners are really not keen on a lot of this stuff. What do we need to do to make sure that we have that buy-in from the practitioner side? I mean, because there's obviously they have skin in the game and they can see that this might not be something in their best interest on occasion, at least politically.
Let me maybe,
sure, Kai, you want to sure.
Carry on, because that's a good point. So that's the challenge I deal with on a daily basis almost, because I'm part of an innovation team, and the piloting is the easy part, and that's maybe 20% of what we do. 80% of this is then to convince the actual stakeholders to use the innovations that we come up with. And it doesn't matter if you invent a machine that prints gold, you still have to convince people to actually use it. And sometimes it can be a real challenge. So even if we can connect all of the data and put all of the tooling in place, we still have to convince doctors to actually step into this virtual VR office room that will actually transform and change the world. Many of them will be like diving in head first, no problem. But there certainly is another group that is much more resistant to this. I don't know exactly what the best answers to that could be, but I think these KOLs, the key opinion leaders, need to be involved in this work. So that's why pharma cannot do these innovations in isolation from that environment. That's why, for example, in Trials at Home, we have a work package dedicated to understanding these stakeholders, understanding their awareness and readiness to actually tackle these sort of things. And then when we understand that, we can then put some education things in place if we understand what the needs are. So I think it's really key to involve the relevant stakeholders in this. Otherwise, you'll have a gold printing machine that nobody's going to use.
Yeah.
Well, Kai, if you got that gold printing machine, please throw it our way. We'll accept it if you got it. Right. Elizabeth, from your perspective, picking up on what Kai's saying, I mean, you're building a platform that has patient-reported outcomes that's driven by the patients. That's very bottom up. How's the practitioner acceptance been of those tools?
Yeah, that's a really relevant question. So there is, in the architecture, is that also clinicians can fill out data in that same system. Most important is that I think clinicians should have a way to validate the data, because as we discussed before, I mean, it's very appreciated if patients fill out data, that there's still a kind of check from the clinician, whether that's a good check or not. That's something else. But what we see, and that's not mentioned here, is that clinicians say it takes too much time. You know, whatever they have to do, we only have 5 minutes per patient or whatever, and we don't want to spend 1 minute or 2 minutes of that on using all kinds of tools. So that is the the most important one, why some say, I already, as you can pull it out, my normal work, I'm fine. But as soon as I have to fill out something extra, I'm not going to do it. And that's the ones who are honest, you know. There are also people who say we will do it and never do it because
No,
it's
do it.
no. But I think so whatever in technology there is, and so transfer to another system or transition to another system, which I fully agree with Kai. We have worked a lot with technical universities, and new having doctors change their way of working is really quite difficult. But the other is really time, time as in minutes, and minutes they can get reimbursed for. So, or you have to give them more money to say, if you use this tool as well, or this platform, or you give extra, or you have to do what we did, make sure which should be available, that patient can pull out their own data and just put it in, so the clinician doesn't have to do it twice.
Nice.
Magda, you wanted to comment quickly, please.
Yeah, just in addition to generating data, there is also using the data, the visualization, and also where these data come. So many of the players come with their own proprietary platform. These things are not necessarily connected data, not necessarily standardized. So I think we need to work not only on the data generation, so that filling the form, so putting data by whomever, whether it's doctor or patient, takes as little time as possible, but also that you can visualize the data and make decisions on their basis. What's the point in having billions of data points if you cannot make any sense out of them? And I think that's today missing in our reflection.
Yeah, Nigel, please.
Yeah, I mean, if you speak to any good EHR vendor, electronic health records vendor, they will tell you one thing. If this doesn't work within the clinical workflow, you can forget it, you know, exactly to all your points that you've raised. So it's about doing with and not to, I think, in collaboration is really critical as well. And I absolutely agree with you, Magda. I think assisted clinical decision-making based on machine learning and so forth, not replacing human cognitive clinical decision-making, but assisting it with, you know, it's not just the data points, it's, you know, no clinician can keep up with the literature now. You know, there's just too much being published, let alone being produced and generated on clinical care. But it has to be a quid pro quo, and this is really critical in terms of every stakeholder needs to understand what their role is within all of this, but what the various drivers are. We also have a work package looking at value propositions in EHDEN and working with different stakeholders to understand how this will support clinical care and outcomes research and so forth, as well as industry research and so forth as well going forward. And this again is about a socio-technical construct. As Kai said, you can create a machine, it's all very good, but if you don't understand all the elements of that human factor, as it were, it will not work. So it's critically important that we understand. I think in part it has to be collaborative, there has to be a quid pro quo, but actually, you know, we are seeing quite a shift in the medical model going forward in the coming years, as we have done already. And it is much more about a relationship of partnering between a citizen patient and their physician and or carer or therapist or whatever, not so paternalistic. And you know, this is also going to impacting on us in the industry as well as who key stakeholders are going forward in the future.
Thank you, Nigel. We have a question here from Ozga Yapur. Thank you. I hope I got that right. Ozga, thank you very much for your question. What do you think about the use of post-authorization patient data for reimbursement? How do you think these data sharing platforms will change how treatments are reimbursed? Magda, I'll go to you first. Obviously, this is a key function of FPO. You're looking at these platforms to rationalize the reimbursement procedure. How is this going to change that we do reimbursement?
I think that all comes down to the outcomes data, and all of that is being built already today. So I think the easy reply is yes, they will. The way how, I would like to come back again to the collaboration. We need to sit together at a table with those who would be making decisions and figure it out, because nobody has this knowledge alone in hand yet.
Yeah,
Elizabeth,
do you need to do a pilot?
Let's do a pilot.
Another pilot, and let's have another plane. Elizabeth, from your perspective, how should Go ahead, please.
So I think these platforms, like we described, are very important to see what a drug is really doing. Also, if patients stop taking it, for what reasons, for what's going on. And we are very well able to follow up on new drugs. And I think that is, of course, there are the standard questions for post-market registries and so on. But also there, I think all the other items we just discussed, what is really relevant for to the patient, like, yes, my skin looks better, but I have a headache, or it's still itching, or whatever. That is not always captured in standard post-market registries, and same as when it's used for HTA. So I think the more holistic we can collect data of patients, maybe we have predicted, thanks to artificial intelligence, that a patient with this and this and this profile is very likely not to take this drug for very long. So we can learn there as well, I suppose. But I'm sure there are people here who know more about that. But that's how I see the future, that you know that in certain patients, or maybe even families, something might be much of a bigger problem. I just mentioned one, and you will laugh about this, but in Duchenne, the use of steroids, a lot of people say, oh yes, but then if they there's weight gain, they might stop. If you see a family coming in who's already heavily overweighted, all of them, you know this patient is much more likely to not follow a steroid treatment at 20 years, because the weight is already a problem, These things are now never captured. That's very interesting. And also about other data, I think we should be much more agile in what we collect, but also have a more holistic view on the patient. But I think everybody agrees here in the team that is what is needed. That's not new, what I say.
Nigel, please.
So 2 quick points. I mean, if you're looking at this in terms of health technology assessment, and actually the last webinar, obviously the series talked a lot about that. What's very clear, if you talk about particularly, value-based pricing and performance-based contracting and so on, you need data. You need to be capturing the right data to answer the right questions, to ensure that people are also reimbursing the right outcomes, let alone that you're experiencing them as a patient. And also in terms of predictive medicine, if you like, we need to move from a model which is effectively an N=1 trial. Based on clinical trials, we know this is what happened in a highly selective population within an artificial protocol, to where I go on a drug and I know kind of what might happen because of the clinical trial data and other evidence, but I don't really know what's going to happen going forward. Is it going to work? Am I going to have adverse events? Is it not going to work? Do I still have adverse events? So we do need to move. I completely agree with you, Elizabeth. And I think in terms of the technological approach of utilizing data to proactively predict outcomes and so forth, which is supported by enhanced machine learning, other approaches, not just in clinical care, but also in the type of research that we'll do within the industry, is going to be a real opportunity, and also probably a challenge in the coming decade.
Nigel, can I just build on what you've said about, yes, we need the data, but we also need to align on what is the outcome that we want to look at, right? Because you can collect a lot of data, which would, if the outcome isn't aligned, then you get nowhere. And I think, again, we have plenty of pilots going on, like in IMI, on big data for better outcomes with prostate cancer, leukemias, etc. It's time to really start implementing that. We have, again, in IMI, the Health Outcomes Observatory, the H2O project that just started. We need to start really scaling it up already now and figuring out how decisions would be made based on the information that is being collected. So I think we have some responsibility to really move from thinking and a vision to really implementing that vision into practice.
And collecting better data as well.
And connecting the data.
Better than we do now.
Yes, well, that's one of the key points here, and one of the key last questions I want to ask. But unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, we're almost out of time, and this will have to be our last question. Hard to believe, it's been very fast. This webinar could have gone for another hour easily. So picking up on this point, what's the one key thing EHDEN needs to do to move decisions closer to the stakeholder, to build a shared vision? What's the one key deliverable we need to do that you would like to see happen? I'll start with you, Nigel. What's the one thing you think, what's going to be the key thing you're graded on about moving this between stakeholders and decisions.
So very briefly, because of time, I mentioned that already earlier, but actually we need to be able to show outcomes, evidence. We need to be able to show that we can conduct research that will impact on clinical practice today, not in several tomorrows. Everything else builds towards that, but that's what we'll be measured on.
Magda, from your perspective, what's the one key thing we need to do?
In addition to what Nigel said, make EHDEN part of the European health data space.
Kai, from your perspective, doing research, what do we need?
Well, I really like the marketplace approach they're already taking, where they realize that the data needs to be curated, needs to be made available, and centralize that through a marketplace where it's then accessible to those that need it. I think that's fantastic. Then people know where to come when you need data. It is the EHDEN marketplace. So I like that. Very pragmatic.
And finally, the patient voice last. Elizabeth,
Yes,
what do we need?
Yeah. I say the obvious. The obvious is to not say we have the patient central, but really to start from the patient. What is relevant? So you measure the right thing. So at the end, what you measure is relevant. And I know the intentions are always there, but sometimes it's just people already have collected data and then they try to find the story that fits the outcome measure. And I think although it's a challenge, we could, in general, I don't say specific here, but in general, we could do better there.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are officially out of time. I'd like to thank my panel. Fantastic discussion today. I'd like to thank our audience and thank you all for your participation. And with that, this EHDEN webinar and the series, unfortunately, is closed. Until next year, thank you, everybody. Have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.